Brookfield was a quiet town, nestled in the rolling hills, a place where everyone knew each other's names and life seemed to move at a slow, predictable pace. It was the kind of town where nothing out of the ordinary ever seemed to happen, where the most exciting event might be a local festival or a high school football game. But all of that changed one crisp autumn evening when Emily Wheeler, a beloved school teacher, disappeared without a trace. Emily was 32 years old, a well-respected figure in the community. She had lived in Brookfield her entire life and was known for her kind heart and dedication to her students. Her husband, Mark, was a quiet man, often keeping to himself, but the couple had always seemed to be the perfect match. No one ever imagined that their lives would be touched by tragedy. It was a Friday when Emily's disappearance was first noticed. She had been seen earlier that day at school, teaching her fifth-grade class with her usual enthusiasm. She had stayed late after class to grade papers and speak with some students who needed extra help. But by nightfall, when she didn't return home, her husband Mark grew concerned. Emily had always been punctual, and when she failed to answer her phone or respond to messages, Mark knew something was wrong. He called a few of Emily's close friends, but no one had heard from her. Panic started to set in. Mark waited for a while, hoping she'd show up, but as the hours dragged on, he decided to report her missing. The local police were alerted, and soon search parties were formed. The entire town rallied together, putting aside their daily lives to look for Emily. They combed through the woods, searched the nearby fields, and even checked the local rivers, but there was no sign of her. As the days passed with no progress, the police began to grow more concerned. There was no ransom note, no phone calls demanding money, and no evidence of any struggle. It was as if Emily had simply vanished into thin air. Her car was found a few miles outside of town, parked along a remote road that led into the woods. The engine was still warm, but there was no sign of Emily. The doors were open, and her purse was found in the front seat, untouched. A single shoe was discovered lying on the ground just a few feet away from the car. It was an eerie scene, one that didn't make sense to anyone involved. Detective Miller and Detective Harlow were called in from the nearby city to assist in the investigation. They had dealt with numerous cases, but this one was different. The lack of evidence was perplexing, and the more they dug into Emily's life, the more questions arose. Mark, her husband, appeared distraught, but there was something off about his demeanor. He wasn't acting like someone who had just lost their spouse. His calmness seemed unnatural, and he struggled to provide clear answers to simple questions. The detectives began to suspect that someone in Emily's life might know more than they were letting on. They started looking into her personal relationships, her work at the school, and her interactions with the people around her. There was no clear motive for anyone to hurt Emily, and yet it was becoming increasingly clear that this was no ordinary disappearance. Detective Miller couldn't shake the feeling that the case was more complicated than it appeared. They were up against something darker than they could have ever imagined, and Emily Wheeler's fate was just the beginning. Detectives Miller and Harlow had barely begun to scratch the surface of Emily Wheeler's life when the investigation took an unexpected turn. At first, their focus had been on the possibility of a random abduction, but as they dug deeper, they began to realize that Emily's disappearance might be more personal than they initially thought. Her friends, family, and even the townspeople, who were all eager to help, couldn't provide any answers. But there was one avenue that demanded further attention: Emily's marriage to Mark Wheeler. The couple had been together for nearly 8 years, and from the outside they appeared to have a stable and loving relationship. They attended church together, often volunteered at community events, and seemed inseparable. But when the detectives interviewed Mark, they were struck by his unsettling calmness. While the town had rallied around the search for Emily, Mark's demeanor remained surprisingly reserved. He didn't seem frantic or panicked as someone whose wife had gone missing. Instead, he answered questions with an eerie stoicism, almost as though he were detached from the situation. It wasn't just that he didn't show outward emotion, it was the way he spoke, the hesitation in his voice, and the unsettling pauses between his words that made Detective Miller uneasy. The detective started questioning those who knew Emily best, her friends, her co-workers, and her family. As they delved into Emily's life, they discovered something that seemed to be a deep-seated issue between her and Mark. Emily had confided in a close friend just a few months before her disappearance that her marriage was struggling. She mentioned feeling increasingly isolated, like Mark was growing distant and unpredictable. Emily had been a patient woman, but she confessed that there were times when she feared her husband's temper, especially when things didn't go his way. She hadn't gone into detail, but it was clear that there were some emotional undercurrents in their relationship that weren't immediately apparent to the outside world. Still, no one had ever suspected Mark of being capable of violence. He had always seemed so mild-mannered, so quiet, and his behavior around Emily had always seemed loving. The townspeople described him as a reserved but decent man, and no one had ever witnessed any overt signs of abuse. But the more the detective spoke to Emily's friends, the more it became clear that there had been a gradual shift in Emily's demeanor. She seemed anxious at times, and there were whispers of strange behavior from Mark, especially in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Some even recalled odd instances where Mark would become irritable or possessive, particularly when Emily would mention spending time with friends or family without him. Then came the revelation about Robert, a fellow teacher at the school where Emily worked. Robert had always been an unassuming figure, but as the detectives dug further into his background, they discovered something unsettling. Emily had been involved in an affair with Robert, though it had been brief, and she had ended the relationship a few months prior to her disappearance. According to some of Emily's close friends, Mark had known about the affair and had become increasingly hostile toward Robert. However, it was unclear how far Mark's jealousy had gone or whether Robert had any role in Emily's disappearance. There was no evidence linking him to the crime, but the detectives couldn't ignore the possibility. As Detective Miller and Harlow re-examined the evidence, they started to realize that the case was beginning to narrow in on Mark. His strange behavior, the underlying tension in his marriage, and the cryptic signs from Emily's friends all pointed to something darker. But they still lacked solid proof, and the absence of a clear motive left them with more questions than answers. It was as though they were standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure of whether they were about to fall into the truth or be led further astray. Emily's fate seemed more elusive with each passing day, and the detectives knew they were on the brink of uncovering a much deeper, far more sinister story than they had ever imagined. The case had begun to take its toll on everyone involved, but Detective Miller and Harlow couldn't afford to rest. The months of searching had yielded no answers, and the town of Brookfield was becoming increasingly tense. Emily's disappearance had shaken the small community to its core, and everyone seemed to be looking for someone to blame. But the lack of evidence had made it difficult to pin the crime on anyone. All the detectives had were fragments of a story, scattered across the town, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. Then, a breakthrough came out of nowhere. One cold, foggy night, Mark Wheeler was found wandering aimlessly on the outskirts of town. His clothes were soaked with rain, and his eyes were wide and unfocused, as though he were in a daze. When he was brought into the station, he appeared disoriented and confused, unable to make sense of where he had been or what had happened to him. The officers who found him noted his strange behavior, and it didn't take long for the detectives to arrive at the conclusion that Mark was involved in something far darker than anyone could have imagined. He was brought in for questioning, but his responses were erratic. At first he clung to his innocence, insisting that he had no idea what had happened to his wife. He explained that he had been out looking for her, desperate to find her, and had wandered into the woods out of frustration. But his story quickly began to unravel when the detectives pressed him for more details. His account was inconsistent, and the more they asked, the more his answers seemed to contradict themselves. It became evident that Mark wasn't telling the whole truth, and something about his demeanor seemed off. He appeared agitated at times, then strangely calm at others, as though he were trying to hold it all together. After hours of questioning, Mark broke. His voice cracked as he confessed to a horrifying crime. He admitted to killing Emily. The detective sat in stunned silence as he explained, in chilling detail, how he had planned and executed the murder. He described how he had lured Emily into the woods on the pretense of a romantic getaway, but once they were isolated, his emotions had taken over. In a fit of rage, he attacked her, killing her without mercy. The details were gruesome, and the detectives struggled to process the coldness with which he recounted the murder. But what shocked them most was not just the murder itself, it was the way Mark spoke about it. There was no remorse, no real emotion in his voice as he described the act. It was as if he were recounting a mundane event, something trivial and unimportant. Mark had planned the crime for months, carefully laying out each detail so that he could rid himself of Emily and start a new life. His confession was chilling not because of the crime itself, but because of the sheer calmness with which he admitted to it. Despite his confession, the detectives couldn't shake the feeling that something didn't add up. Mark's story seemed too rehearsed, too precise, as though he had been anticipating the moment when he would finally break down and admit to what he had done. There was no sign of struggle at the scene of the crime, no physical evidence linking him to the murder, and yet he insisted that he had killed Emily. The detectives began to question whether Mark was the sole perpetrator or if he had been coerced or manipulated into committing the crime. His confession didn't fit with the image they had of him, someone who had always been so quiet, so reserved. It didn't seem like the actions of a man who had just snapped. Detective Miller, in particular, couldn't shake the feeling that Mark was hiding something, and that there was more to the story than he was letting on. Mark's confession was the first piece of the puzzle, but it didn't complete the picture. As the investigation progressed, the detectives dug deeper, determined to uncover the truth, no matter how dark it might be. What had driven Mark to kill his wife? And more importantly, was he truly alone in this twisted crime? Or had someone else been pulling the strings all along? The answers seemed just out of reach, but Detective Miller and Harlow knew that they were closing in on a truth that would send shockwaves through the entire town. As the investigation moved forward, Mark Wheeler's confession raised more questions than answers. His cold, almost indifferent recounting of the murder left the detectives with a nagging feeling that something was missing. Despite his admission, the lack of physical evidence, along with the eerie calmness he displayed during the interrogation, made Detective Miller and Harlow wonder if there was more to the story. The case, which had seemed so straightforward, was starting to feel far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Detective Harlow decided to re-examine the crime scene, hoping that something they had missed might suddenly become clear. They combed through the woods again, focusing on the area where Emily's body had been found. Everything about the scene seemed staged, almost too perfect, as though someone had gone to great lengths to make it appear like a simple crime of passion. But as Harlow examined the surroundings more carefully, he stumbled upon something that immediately caught his attention. Hidden among the thick underbrush was a small, weathered notebook, half buried under a pile of leaves. The notebook contained a series of cryptic, disturbing messages. They appeared to be written in a hurried scrawl, as though the writer had been desperate to get the words out. At first glance, the messages made little sense. They spoke of betrayal, fear, and what seemed like an attempt to reach out to someone who was not Mark. One message in particular stood out. "I know what's coming. He's not alone. Robert, please help me." Detective Harlow immediately showed the notebook to Miller. The mention of Robert was a stark revelation, bringing their attention back to Emily's brief affair with the man she had once worked with. Robert had been cleared of any involvement early in the investigation, but the message from Emily suggested otherwise. It was as though she had known that her life was in danger and was trying to reach out to someone she trusted, but it was too late. Detective Miller felt a deep sense of unease settle in his chest. It was now clear that Mark wasn't acting alone. They began to re-examine Robert's background, delving into his personal history with Emily and his interactions with Mark. The more they learned about him, the darker the picture became. Robert had always been a quiet, unremarkable man to the outside world, but the detectives discovered that his obsession with Emily had gone far beyond the affair. After Emily had ended the relationship, Robert had become fixated on her, watching her from a distance, unable to let go of the past. He had even shown up at Emily's house on multiple occasions, though he had always claimed to be just checking in as a colleague and friend. The detectives also learned that Robert had been fired from the school just weeks before Emily's disappearance. He had been caught sending inappropriate messages to other staff members and had been reported for harassing Emily, though she had refused to press charges. The relationship between Robert and Mark, which had always been strained, had worsened during this time. The jealousy and animosity between the two men had been building for months, but no one had suspected it would lead to violence. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together, the detectives uncovered something even more chilling. Robert had been stalking Emily in the days leading up to her disappearance. Security footage from the school revealed that Robert had visited her classroom just days before the murder, lingering in the hallway for several minutes. It was a small detail, easily overlooked, but in hindsight, it now seemed like an ominous sign. The detective's suspicions began to grow. Mark's confession, while shocking, now seemed like part of a much larger and more complex plan. They theorized that Robert had been manipulating Mark, using his jealousy and resentment to push him toward committing the murder. Robert had orchestrated the entire thing, carefully pulling the strings from the shadows, and Mark had become his unwitting pawn. The true horror of the crime began to take shape, and Detective Miller could hardly believe the depths of betrayal that had occurred. They now had to confront Mark with the truth that he wasn't the only one responsible for Emily's death, but what they didn't anticipate was the chilling revelation that awaited them. When Mark was presented with the new evidence, his demeanor changed. His face grew pale, and for the first time he seemed genuinely frightened. He admitted that he had been in contact with Robert after the murder. The two men had been planning something far more twisted than anyone had realized. Mark, who had once been seen as the sole perpetrator, now seemed like a puppet, with Robert as the mastermind pulling the strings all along. The truth was far darker than they could have imagined. As Detective Miller and Harlow stood in the interrogation room, staring at Mark Wheeler, the true depth of the case began to sink in. Mark's confession had seemed to wrap up the case, but with each new revelation, the detectives were left with a growing sense of horror. It was clear that Mark had been manipulated by Robert, but just how deep did this manipulation run? Mark had confessed to the murder, but he was not the mastermind. Robert had been orchestrating the entire plan from the shadows, using Mark's insecurities and jealousy to control him. The detectives worked tirelessly, piecing together the final details of the twisted relationship between the two men. Robert had been far more involved in Emily's life than anyone had realized. Not only had he been stalking her for months, but he had been pushing Mark to the edge, planting seeds of doubt and hatred in his mind. He had fed Mark lies, convincing him that Emily's affair with him was just the tip of the iceberg, and that Emily was planning to leave him for another man. Robert's goal had never been about Emily. It had always been about Mark. He had manipulated him into a corner, using his growing rage to push him toward violence. What had started as a brief affair had escalated into a full-blown obsession. Robert had been feeding Mark's suspicions, whispering in his ear, telling him that Emily didn't love him anymore, that she was cheating again, and that the only way to make everything right was to eliminate the threat. Mark had become a pawn in Robert's sick game, unable to see the full extent of the manipulation until it was too late. When Emily ended the affair with Robert, he became unhinged, convinced that if he couldn't have her, no one could. It was Robert's obsession with power and control that had driven the plot. He had carefully chosen the perfect moment to strike, waiting for Mark to be vulnerable, for him to doubt his own worth and his marriage. Robert had known exactly how to break him down. His plan had been methodical, subtle, and terrifyingly effective. By the time Mark had carried out the murder, he had already been brainwashed into believing that it was the only way to restore his life, to regain control over everything he thought he was losing. When the detectives turned their attention to Robert, they realized just how far he had gone. He had been manipulating Mark from a distance, using their shared hatred of Emily to drive a wedge between them. Robert had known that Mark would be the perfect person to carry out the murder. Mark's jealousy and frustration with his marriage had made him the ideal target for Robert's control. And once the murder had been committed, Robert's involvement had remained a shadow, hidden beneath the surface, until the detectives unearthed the truth. Mark, now fully aware of the extent of Robert's manipulation, was horrified by the role he had played in Emily's death. He had been a willing participant in the murder, but he had been driven by a force far greater than his own emotions. Robert had been the puppet master, pulling the strings of his life, convincing him that killing Emily was the only solution to his problems. Mark's confession had been a necessary first step, but it was the final revelation, his connection to Robert, that turned the case from a simple crime of passion into something far darker. As the detectives moved forward with their investigation, the pieces of the puzzle came together. They found more evidence linking Robert to the crime. Surveillance footage from a nearby store showed him lurking around the area on the night of the murder. A series of threatening messages from Robert to Emily had also surfaced, suggesting that he had been aware of Mark's plan all along. He had manipulated the situation from the beginning, setting everything in motion and then stepping back, allowing Mark to take the fall. Robert was arrested soon after, and the truth of his involvement in the crime became public knowledge. Mark, though guilty of the murder, was not the sole instigator. The twisted nature of Robert's manipulation had been the driving force behind the entire crime. As the trial unfolded, both men faced the consequences of their actions. Mark was sentenced to life in prison, while Robert was charged with conspiracy to commit murder, among other crimes. The town of Brookfield, once so peaceful, would never be the same. The horror of Emily Wheeler's death reverberated through the community, leaving scars that would never fully heal. Detective Miller and Harlow, though satisfied with the resolution, couldn't shake the lingering feeling of unease. The case had shown them the true depth of human manipulation, and it left them wondering how often it happens, unnoticed, just beneath the surface of everyday life. Emily Wheeler's death had been tragic, but the story didn't end with her. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession, control, and the darkness that could lurk within the most unlikely of people. The twisted minds of Mark and Robert had caused irreparable damage, but in the end, the truth had been uncovered. The community could now begin to heal, but the scars of the crime would remain forever.